Hey guys, tonight we're diving into one of those medieval professions that sounds kind of dramatic and intense in movies, but in reality was just deeply, deeply sad and inconvenient for everyone involved. We're talking about executioners, the people nobody wanted to be, nobody wanted to know, and nobody wanted living next door. So go ahead and dim the lights, get comfortable, maybe grab that extra pillow, and let's float back to a time when your job could literally make you untouchable, in the worst way possible. Now, when we think about medieval executioners today, we've got this whole image built up in our heads, right? The hooded figure, the big axe, maybe some dramatic last words. Very theatrical, very marketable, I guess. But the actual reality of being an executioner in medieval Europe was less respected master of the blade and more, please don't let anyone see me buying bread. Because here's the thing, medieval society ran on a very specific set of rules about honor, purity, and social standing, and executioners, well, they violated pretty much all of those rules just by showing up to work. They were legally necessary, but socially radioactive. Towns needed them, absolutely. Someone had to carry out the sentences handed down by courts, but nobody, and I mean nobody, wanted to actually interact with them outside of that professional necessity. Let's start with the most obvious problem, the job itself. Executioners were required to end people's lives as part of the legal system, and in medieval Christian Europe, that created an immediate spiritual problem. See, taking a life was considered a sin, a pretty serious one, even when it was legally sanctioned. Even when the person being sentenced had committed terrible offenses themselves, the executioner was still the one doing the deed, and that meant their soul was, in the eyes of many, in constant jeopardy. The church had this complicated relationship with the whole thing. On one hand, they acknowledged that earthly authorities needed to maintain order. Justice had to be carried out. Punishments had to be enforced. But on the other hand, the person actually swinging the axe or pulling the lever or whatever method was being used, that person was tainted, spiritually compromised. Some priests refused to give executioners communion. Some wouldn't even allow them inside churches. Imagine that. Your job is literally assigned to you by the legal system. You're doing what the state requires, and you can't even attend Sunday services without causing a scene.
And it gets worse, because this wasn't just about the executioner's own soul. In medieval thinking, that spiritual contamination was contagious. Just being near an executioner could taint you. Touching one? Even worse. Sharing a meal? Absolutely out of the question. This wasn't just superstition, by the way. This was encoded in actual laws and social customs. In many towns across Germany, France, and other parts of Europe, executioners were legally classified as dishonorable. Now, dishonorable is a polite translation. What it really meant was that they existed in this weird legal and social underclass. They had fewer rights than regular citizens. They couldn't join guilds, couldn't hold public office, couldn't serve on juries. In some places, they couldn't even testify in court because their word was considered inherently unreliable due to their profession. You know, the profession they didn't choose but were stuck with. Very fair, very logical. And this dishonor wasn't just a personal thing. It was hereditary. If your father was an executioner, congrats, you were probably going to be one too. Not because it was a respected family trade passed down with pride, but because nobody else would marry you, hire you, or let you do anything else. You were born into social isolation and you die in it. Executioner families often intermarried with other executioner families because, well, who else would have them? There were literally dynasties of executioners, multiple generations, sometimes spanning centuries, all doing the same grim work because the alternative was nothing, no other options. The Sanson family in France, for example, executioners for 6 generations. 6, from the 1600s all the way through the French Revolution. Charles-Henri Sanson, probably the most famous of them, ended up being the one who, well, let's just say he was very busy during the Revolution. And he hated it, absolutely hated it. But what else was he going to do? His great-great-great-grandfather had taken the job, and now here he was, stuck with it. Let's talk about where executioners lived, because that's another layer of this whole mess. In many medieval towns, executioners weren't allowed to live in the city walls. They had to live outside. In some cases, they were specifically assigned to live near the execution grounds, which themselves were placed outside town limits, because, of course they were. Nobody wants death happening in the town square. Well, okay, sometimes it did happen in the town square for maximum public viewing, but the executioner still had to go home outside the walls afterward.
This meant executioners were physically separated from normal community life. They couldn't just pop into the market whenever they wanted. When they did enter town for supplies, there were rules. In some places, they had to wear specific clothing or markings so people could identify them from a distance and avoid them. Bright colors sometimes, specific hats, little bells, anything to make sure regular folks had fair warning that an executioner was approaching so they could cross the street. And the really wild part, even their money was considered tainted. In some regions, executioners were required to handle coins with gloves, or shopkeepers would make them put money in a bowl of water or vinegar before touching it. Can you imagine going to buy food and the vendor treats your coins like they're contaminated? Every single transaction a little reminder that you're considered fundamentally unclean. Now, you might think, okay, but at least the pay was good, right? Hazard pay, danger money, something to make up for all this social misery? Well, sometimes, maybe, it varied wildly. Some executioners were salaried employees of the town or the local lord. They'd get a regular stipend plus payment per task. But per task is doing some heavy lifting there, because executioners weren't just executing people. That was actually a relatively small part of the job in many places, because, there weren't always that many executions happening on a regular basis. So to make ends meet, executioners took on side work. And by side work, I mean all the other jobs nobody else wanted. Cleaning up waste from the streets, removing deceased animals, clearing out latrines, running the local prison or dungeon, applying certain punishments that didn't end in someone passing but were still considered too degrading or dishonorable for anyone else to administer. Basically, if it was unpleasant, unsanitary, or socially contaminating, it got added to the executioner's job description. In some places, executioners also worked as knackers, which meant processing the bodies of animals that had passed, especially horses. They'd skin them, render the fat, sell the hides and bones. Useful work, economically necessary work, but also considered deeply dishonorable because it involved handling the remains of creatures. And because of that association, anything the executioner touched became suspect, including medical services, weirdly enough. See, here's a strange contradiction. Despite being considered dishonorable and spiritually tainted, many executioners also practiced medicine. Specifically, they often became the local bone setters, tooth pullers, and general surgeons for common folk. Why? Well, because executioners had anatomical knowledge. They knew bodies. They knew how joints worked, where bones connected, how much force it took to separate certain parts. Grim knowledge, sure, but useful if you needed a dislocated shoulder popped back in or a bad tooth yanked out. For a lot of common people, especially the very poor, the executioner was the only medical option they could afford. Real physicians served the wealthy. Barber surgeons were a step down, but still cost money. The executioner? He'd do it cheap, and he knew what he was doing. but you'd have to live with the social stigma of having been touched by him, of letting someone dishonorable put their hands on you. Some people were desperate enough. Others would rather suffer. Franz Schmidt is probably one of the most well-documented executioners we know about, and that's because he kept a journal. For over 40 years in Nuremberg, from the 1570s into the 1610s, he recorded every single task he performed. And reading through it is just this steady, monotonous list of human misery. He wasn't dramatic about it. He wasn't philosophical. Just, on this date, did this. On that date, did that. Very matter-of-fact, very tired. He performed hundreds of tasks over his career, and you can feel, even through the sparse entries, that he didn't want to be doing it. He'd inherited the position from his father, who'd become an executioner under complicated circumstances that Franz considered unjust. Franz spent his entire career trying to restore his family's honor. He petitioned, he worked respectable side jobs, he practiced medicine and became quite respected for his healing work, ironically. And eventually, after decades, he succeeded. He got an official letter from the town council declaring his family honorable again. He could retire. His children wouldn't be forced into the profession. He'd done it. And you can almost feel the relief radiating off the page when he recorded that final entry. He was free. But most executioners never got that. Most just continued, generation after generation, stuck in this weird social limbo where they were necessary but despised, needed but avoided, paid by the state but excluded from civic life. The isolation did strange things to people. Some executioners became extremely religious, desperately trying to counterbalance the spiritual weight of their work. They'd pray constantly, donate to churches, fund masses for the souls of the departed, anything to tip the scales back towards salvation. Others went the opposite direction and leaned into the role, becoming deliberately intimidating or mysterious, because if society was going to treat them like monsters anyway, why not use that fear to their advantage? There were occasional exceptions. Some executioners in larger cities managed to accumulate significant wealth, especially if they had a monopoly on certain profitable side businesses. A few even became somewhat respected in limited circles, particularly if they were skilled at the medical work. But these were outliers. For the vast majority, it was a life of grinding poverty, social death, and spiritual anxiety. Children of executioners had it especially rough. Imagine growing up knowing that every other kid in town was forbidden by their parents from playing with you, that you'd never be apprenticed to a normal trade, that you'd never marry anyone outside the tiny circle of other executioner families, that your future was already decided, mapped out by an accident of birth, and there was essentially nothing you could do about it. Some tried to run away, start over in a new town where nobody knew their family history. But medieval Europe was surprisingly interconnected, especially among certain professions. Word got around, and if you were caught lying about your background, it only made things worse. So most just accepted it, learned the trade from their fathers, took over when the time came, taught their own sons. The cycle continued. And the thing is, from a practical standpoint, the whole system was kind of absurd. These men were performing a legal function, enforcing the decisions of courts and rulers. They were literally agents of state power. But instead of being respected as officers of the law, they were treated like contaminants. The state needed them, paid them, ordered them to work, and then abandoned them socially. It's this perfect example of medieval cognitive dissonance. Justice must be done, order must be maintained,
Wrongdoers must face consequences, but someone has to actually do those things, and we're going to make sure that person suffers for it, even though we're the ones who commanded it in the first place. Very rational, very consistent. Let's float over to the actual work environment, because that added another layer of difficulty. Execution methods in medieval Europe were varied and often highly technical. This wasn't just a matter of swinging an axe and hoping for the best, though sometimes it was exactly that, and it went horribly wrong, but we'll get to that. Different crimes carried different methods. Different social classes were treated to different procedures. Nobility might get a relatively quick beheading. Commoners might face hanging. Certain specific offenses came with specific, often elaborate methods designed to match the crime symbolically. The executioner had to know all of this, had to be able to perform each method competently, and had to deal with the consequences when things didn't go smoothly. Because here's the thing nobody talks about. These procedures didn't always work cleanly. Axes missed, ropes broke, mechanisms failed, and when that happened, the executioner had to just keep going, try again, in front of a crowd, while people screamed or jeered or in some cases rioted because a botched procedure was considered a sign from above that the sentence was unjust.
There are records of executioners being attacked by mobs when things went wrong, beaten, sometimes ended themselves by the very crowd that had gathered to watch them work. The irony being that the executioner was just carrying out orders, but if those orders were executed badly, literally, then suddenly he was the villain, not the judge who passed the sentence, not the lord who demanded it, the guy with the axe. So you had to be good at it. You had to be precise, and you had to develop a kind of emotional callousness, because otherwise the job would destroy you mentally. You were ending lives on a regular basis, lives of people who might be guilty of serious crimes, or might have just stolen a loaf of bread because they were starving. The range of offenses that could lead to the most serious punishments was wild, and you, as the executioner, had no say in it. You just did what you were told. Some executioners drank heavily. Others developed elaborate rituals or superstitions to cope. A few seemed to just shut down emotionally, becoming mechanical in their approach. Do the job, collect the payment, go home. Don't think about it. Repeat. And through all of this, you're living in a society that considers you spiritually polluted, that won't let you eat at the same table as normal citizens, that makes you live outside the town walls, that marks your clothing so people can avoid you, that ensures your children will inherit your dishonor and your profession, whether they want it or not. So yeah, nobody wanted to be a medieval executioner. And honestly, can you blame them? We're just getting started here, so let that settle in for a moment. The quiet tragedy of men stuck in a job that slowly eroded their humanity, performed necessary functions for a society that rewarded them with contempt, and passed that legacy down through generations like a curse. Let's keep going.
So, where were we? Right. The absolute social nightmare of being a medieval executioner. Let's dig a little deeper into how this whole thing actually worked on a practical level, because the day-to-day reality was somehow even more complicated than just being universally avoided at the market. First, let's talk about how someone actually became an executioner in the first place, because it's not like there was a job posting at the Guildhall. Wanted, person willing to be socially destroyed in exchange for irregular pay and eternal dishonor. Apply within. In most cases, as we touched on earlier, you were born into it. Your father was an executioner, so you became one. Simple, terrible, unavoidable. But what about the first generation? How did someone initially end up in this position? Well, there were a few paths, and none of them were great. Sometimes a convicted criminal would be offered a deal: face your sentence or become the executioner. And I'm sure that seemed like an obvious choice in the moment. Life over the alternative? Sure, sign me up. But then you'd spend the rest of that life wishing you'd taken the alternative, because you weren't really alive anymore, not socially. You were a ghost, a walking reminder of the justice system's need for someone to do its dirty work. Other times, someone who'd committed a dishonorable act, even if it technically wasn't criminal, might end up pushed into the role. Loss of honor was a huge deal in medieval society. If you'd been publicly shamed or caught doing something considered fundamentally degrading, you might find that the only employment available to you was, well, this: the job for people who'd already lost everything. And occasionally, very occasionally, someone might volunteer, usually out of absolute desperation. Crushing poverty, starvation, no options. The town needs an executioner, you need money, and you're desperate enough to think you can handle the social consequences. Spoiler, you couldn't. Nobody ever really could.
Once you were in the job, training happened on the job. There wasn't exactly an executioner academy. Your predecessor, usually your father or another family member, would show you the techniques: how to maintain the tools, how to position the condemned, how to strike accurately, how to test ropes, how to manage crowds. All the grim little details that made the difference between a procedure that went smoothly and one that turned into a public disaster. And you needed to learn fast, because your reputation, such as it was, depended on competence. A skilled executioner could at least take some small pride in doing the job efficiently, in minimizing suffering even, in being professional. It was literally the only source of dignity available. Mess it up, and you didn't even have that. Let's talk about the tools for a minute, because maintaining them was a whole part of the job. Axes and swords had to be kept sharp, extremely sharp. A dull blade meant a messier procedure, more suffering, more chances for things to go wrong. So executioners spent considerable time on maintenance, sharpening, oiling, checking for defects in the metal. Some executioners became known for having particularly fine blades. There are records of executioners commissioning custom-made swords from master craftsmen, paying considerable sums for weapons that would do the job as cleanly as possible. Which is darkly ironic when you think about it. Pouring money into a tool designed to end lives because doing it well was the only professional standard you had access to. Gallows and scaffolds had to be maintained too. Wood rotted, ropes frayed, trapdoors stuck, mechanisms failed. In many towns, the executioner was responsible for all of this, building the scaffolds, testing them, making sure everything worked. So add carpenter and engineer to the list of skills required for a job that supposedly anyone could do. The actual execution site was also the executioner's responsibility, keeping it clear, managing the crowds, and cleaning up afterward. And that last part, yeah, that was probably the worst part of an already terrible job, the aftermath. Someone had to deal with the remains, and that someone was usually the executioner. In some places, the bodies of the condemned weren't given proper burials.
they'd be left hanging as warnings, or buried in unconsecrated ground, or just disposed of. And the executioner handled all of it, which only added to the spiritual taint, because now you weren't just ending lives, you were also denying people proper Christian burial, another sin, another weight on your already burdened soul. Regional differences in how executioners were treated are kind of fascinating in a grim way. In German-speaking territories, the dishonor was particularly codified and severe. The concept of Unehrlichkeit, or dishonorableness, was deeply embedded in law and custom. Executioners were explicitly listed among dishonorable professions, along with knackers, skinners, gravediggers, and a few others. These professions formed their own little underclass. They could interact with each other, sometimes. Their children could intermarry. But crossing the boundary between honorable and dishonorable society was nearly impossible. There are records of towns debating for years whether to allow a former executioner's son to join a guild, even if he'd never actually performed an execution himself. Usually, the answer was no. In France, the situation was similar, but slightly less legally rigid. Executioners were still avoided and stigmatized, but there was occasionally more flexibility. A successful executioner who'd accumulated wealth might be able to buy some level of social acceptance, or at least tolerance. His children might, with enough money and distance from the profession, eventually marry into lower merchant families. It wasn't common, but it happened. In England, it had its own peculiarities. English executioners were often slightly less stigmatized than their continental counterparts, possibly because the role was more directly tied to royal authority. The executioner served the crown, and that provided a thin shield of legitimacy. Thin, but present. English executioners could sometimes live within city limits, could sometimes attend church without being physically expelled. Small mercies, but meaningful ones, if you were living that life. But even in England, nobody wanted the job. It was still isolating, still spiritually troubling, still dangerous when things went wrong. There are records of English executioners petitioning for hazard pay after being attacked by mobs, of needing armed escorts to and from work, of living under assumed names to avoid harassment. Let's float over to the economic reality for a moment, because that's another layer of this mess. We mentioned that pay varied, but let's get into the specifics, because they're kind of wild. In many German towns, an executioner might receive a small annual salary, maybe enough to cover basic rent and food, but not much more. Then he'd get paid per task, and the rates were itemized. There'd be a set fee for a beheading, a different fee for a hanging, different rates for other procedures. Sometimes the fee would vary based on the social status of the condemned. Ending a nobleman paid more than ending a peasant, because of course it did. But here's where it gets interesting. Executioners also often had the right to certain perks. They could claim the clothing of the condemned, for example, and sell it. They could claim any ropes used, which could be sold as good luck charms. Yes, really. People bought pieces of rope from hangings because they were considered to have magical properties, protection against harm, good fortune, the medieval equivalent of buying a lottery ticket, I guess. In some places, executioners had the right to demand a toll from certain people entering the city, bakers sometimes, or people selling specific goods. The reasoning was completely arbitrary, but it provided a small, steady income. Of course, collecting those tolls meant confronting people who didn't want to pay, didn't want to touch you, and sometimes would rather turn around and leave than hand money to an executioner. So that was fun. The medical practice we mentioned earlier could actually be quite lucrative. For all the social stigma, people needed medical care, and an executioner who was skilled at bone setting or tooth pulling could build a side business. Franz Schmidt, our journal-keeping friend from Nuremberg, made a considerable portion of his income from healing work. He treated hundreds of patients, set broken bones, treated wounds, prescribed herbal remedies.
And here's the weird contradiction. People who would never eat at the same table as him, who would cross the street to avoid him, would still come to him when they were in pain, would let him touch them, work on their bodies, prescribe treatments, because pain overrides stigma, apparently. Or maybe because when you're poor and hurting, you take help where you can find it, social consequences be damned. Some executioners supplemented their income by working as dog catchers. Stray dogs were a problem in medieval towns, and catching them was considered dishonorable work, so naturally it fell to the executioner. Others served as night watchmen or prison guards, jobs that at least kept them employed and gave them some authority, even if that authority came with contempt. Let's talk about family life, because that's where the quiet tragedy really settles in. Imagine being married to an executioner. You didn't just marry a person, you married into permanent social exile. Executioners' wives were stigmatized too. They couldn't join women's social groups, couldn't work in respectable positions, couldn't attend certain church functions. Their children were marked from birth. And yet, these were still families, still people trying to live normal lives within absurdly abnormal constraints. Executioners' wives kept house, raised children, tried to create some sense of normalcy. Some of them helped with the medical practice, learning herbal medicine or assisting with treatments. Others managed side businesses, selling items their husbands had rights to, navigating markets where they were barely tolerated. Children growing up in executioner families had their childhoods shaped by isolation. They couldn't attend regular schools in many places. They played alone or only with other executioner children. They learned early that they were different, marked, set apart. And they learned the family trade, because what else was there? There are heartbreaking records of executioners trying to get their children out of the profession, petitioning town councils, paying for apprenticeships in other trades, only to have the guildmasters refuse once they learned the family background, trying to marry their daughters to men outside the dishonorable professions, offering large dowries, only to be rejected. The desperation just radiates off these historical documents. Some families managed small victories. A daughter married to a barber surgeon, which was low status but at least honorable. A son apprenticed to a less stigmatized dishonorable profession like a skinner. Not great, but better than executioner. These were celebrated like major achievements because they were. But mostly, the cycle just continued. Sons became executioners because it was the only option. Daughters married executioners' sons from other families. Grandchildren inherited the same isolation their grandparents had lived with, generation after generation. The psychological toll of all this is something we can only glimpse through the historical record, but it's there if you look. Franz Schmidt's journal entries get shorter and more clipped as the years go on. Early in his career, he sometimes adds details, context, observations. Later, it's just bare facts. Date, name, procedure. Date, name, procedure. The emotional exhaustion is almost tangible. There are records of executioners requesting transfers to different towns, trying to escape reputations, start fresh somewhere else. It rarely worked. The network of executioner families was well known, and information traveled. You couldn't outrun your own profession. Some executioners turned to alcohol. There are tavern records showing executioners running up considerable tabs, drinking alone because nobody would sit with them. Others became deeply withdrawn, barely speaking, just doing the work and going home. A few had full breakdowns and had to be replaced. And through all of this, the work continued. Because towns needed executioners, the legal system demanded them. Justice, as medieval society understood it, required someone to carry out the sentences. So the same communities that stigmatized these men also employed them, paid them, ordered them to work, and then went right back to treating them like contaminants. The condemned themselves had complicated relationships with executioners. Some begged for mercy, as if the executioner had any power to grant it. He didn't. He was just following orders. Others raged at him, cursed him, tried to attack him. A few understood that he was just doing a job and treated him with a strange sort of professional courtesy. Those were probably the easiest cases, emotionally speaking. Executioners sometimes had to deal with people they knew. In smaller towns, you might be ordered to punish or end the life of someone you'd grown up around, someone who'd been kind to you, or at least less cruel than others, and you had no choice. Refuse, and you'd lose the position, which meant destitution, because what else could you do? So you did it, and you lived with it. There are a few records of executioners refusing specific tasks and facing consequences, loss of position, fines, in extreme cases becoming condemned themselves for failing to perform their duty. So the pressure was immense. Do your job no matter what, or lose everything. Let's drift over to the public perception side of things for a moment, because that's where some really strange contradictions emerge. On one hand, executioners were reviled and avoided. On the other hand, they were also objects of fascination. People wanted to know about them, as long as they didn't have to actually interact with them. There were folk beliefs about executioners having special powers, the ability to sense guilt, to curse people, to heal certain conditions with their touch, despite or maybe because of their connection to the end of life. None of this was true, obviously, but the myths persisted.
The hand of glory was supposedly more potent if an executioner prepared it. Certain folk remedies required ingredients that only an executioner could legally obtain. Pieces of rope from hangings, as mentioned, were sold as charms. Fat rendered from the condemned was thought to have medicinal properties. Blood from the executed was believed to cure various ailments. So you had this bizarre situation where executioners were spiritually tainted and socially untouchable, but also sought after for magical purposes. They were too polluted to eat dinner with, but just mysterious enough to maybe, possibly have access to dark powers. Medieval logic at its finest. Some executioners leaned into this, cultivated an air of mystery, wore distinctive clothing even when not required to, acted cryptic. If society was going to treat you like a dark figure anyway, you might as well use it to your advantage. It didn't win you friends, but it might win you a little fear-based respect, or at least fewer people actively harassing you. Others went the opposite direction and tried desperately to seem normal, dressed plainly, spoke softly, tried to blend in as much as someone in their position possibly could. It didn't really work, but the effort was there. We're settling into the rhythm of this now, the slow, grinding reality of a profession that trapped people in cycles of dishonor,
generation after generation. The quiet desperation of trying to live a normal life within profoundly abnormal circumstances. The contradictions of being both necessary and despised. Let's keep drifting through this strange, sad corner of history.
All right, let's settle in a bit deeper here, because we've barely scratched the surface of just how complicated and miserable this whole situation was. We've talked about the social stigma, the hereditary trap, the economic struggles. Now let's get into some of the more specific, documented cases that really show you what life was like for these people. Real names, real stories, real examples of just how thoroughly this profession could consume someone's entire existence. Let's start with the Sansons family, because their story spans so much time and demonstrates the hereditary nature of this nightmare so perfectly. The Sansons were executioners in Paris and the surrounding region for about 200 years. 6 generations. 6. That's roughly from the early 1600s all the way through to 1847. Think about that. Your great-great-great-grandfather takes a job, and your great-great-grandson is still stuck doing it 2 centuries later. The first Sanson to take the position was Charles Sanson, who became executioner of Paris around 1635. He didn't come from an executioner family. He'd been a soldier, then worked in the household of a previous executioner. When that executioner passed without a son to inherit the position, Charles married his widow. And that was that. He was in. The job transferred through the marriage, and suddenly Charles was an executioner, whether he'd really thought through the implications or not. He passed it to his son, who passed it to his son, who passed it to his son. Each generation probably hoping their kids might escape, but each generation finding that hope crushed by reality. The most famous of the Sansons was Charles Henri, who held the position during the French Revolution, and oh boy did he hold it during the wrong time to be an executioner in France. Charles Henri seems to have been a thoughtful, melancholic man. He kept detailed records, like Franz Schmidt. He performed his duties professionally. He didn't enjoy the work, but he did it competently, because that's what his family did. That was their function. And then the revolution happened, and suddenly competence became a curse. Because during the terror, Charles Henri's workload went from occasional to absolutely relentless. The new device, the one everyone's heard of, was introduced as a more humane, egalitarian method. Same procedure for everyone, regardless of social class. Quick and efficient. And Charles Henri had to operate it. Day after day, week after week, month after month. He processed thousands of people, nobles, clergy, revolutionaries who fell out of favor, regular people caught in the political chaos, women, the elderly, teenagers. It didn't matter. The tribunals sentenced them, and Charles Henri had to carry out the sentences. And he hated it. He absolutely hated it. There are accounts of him becoming increasingly withdrawn, depressed, haunted by the sheer volume of what he was being ordered to do. But he couldn't stop. Refuse, and he'd be suspected of counter-revolutionary sympathy. He'd end up on the same platform he operated. So he kept going, doing his job, coming home exhausted and emotionally destroyed. And this went on for years. After the terror ended, he continued as executioner because what else could he do? The Sanson family business continued. His son took over eventually, then his grandson.
The last Sanson executioner, Henri Clement, served until 1847, when he was finally removed from the position due to debts and personal problems. The family that had served France for over 2 centuries, performing one of the state's most necessary but most reviled functions, ended in financial ruin and social obscurity. The Sansons story is particularly well documented, but it wasn't unique. There were executioner dynasties across Europe: the Reichardt family in Bavaria, the Schmidt family in Nuremberg, which we've mentioned, the Gregorius family in various German states, each with similar patterns: generations trapped in the role, occasional attempts to escape, mostly failure and resignation. Let's talk about some specific incidents that showed just how precarious this position was, because one of the constant anxieties for any executioner was the possibility that a procedure would go wrong, and when it did, the consequences could be severe.
In 1587, Mary Stuart, the former Queen of Scots, was sentenced to be beheaded at Fotheringhay Castle in England. The executioner tasked with this was reportedly nervous. This wasn't just anyone. This was a queen, former sovereign. The political implications were massive, and any mistake would be scrutinized forever. And he made mistakes, plural. The first blow missed the neck cleanly and struck the back of her head. The second blow hit the neck, but didn't completely finish the job. He had to use the axe to complete what should have been a single clean procedure, in front of witnesses, in front of the court. After beheading a queen in the messiest way possible, the executioner then made it even worse by attempting to hold up the head and announce, "God save the Queen," but the head was only attached by a wig, which came off in his hand. The actual head fell to the floor. Can you imagine the sheer horror and humiliation of that moment? That executioner's name was probably known to every executioner in England afterward as a cautionary tale. The job was hard enough without botching the most high-profile case of your career. And this wasn't isolated. There are numerous records of procedures going wrong: axes bouncing off, blades breaking, ropes snapping. Each time, the executioner had to just keep going, finish the job somehow, while dealing with the crowd's reaction, which could range from shocked silence to violent anger. In some cases, a badly performed task led to the executioner himself being attacked in Serbia. In 1500s Germany, there's a record of an executioner being dragged from a scaffold and severely beaten by a mob after a procedure went poorly. He survived, but was so injured he couldn't work for months. He received no compensation for his injuries, no protection, just hope you heal up so you can get back to work, I guess.
The crowds at these events were their own complicated factor, because these were public spectacles, at least for more serious cases. Towns would announce the date and time. People would gather, sometimes hundreds of people, sometimes thousands, depending on the case's notoriety. And the executioner had to perform under that pressure. Some crowds were hostile to the condemned and wanted the procedure done harshly. Others were sympathetic, especially if the condemned was popular or the crime seemed minor. The executioner had to read the room while also following the legal requirements of the sentence. Too harsh, and you might face backlash for cruelty. Too merciful, and you'd be accused of not properly serving justice. There was no winning. Executioners developed various techniques for managing crowds. Some would give little speeches beforehand, explaining the justice of the sentence, trying to frame everything in official, legitimate terms.
Others worked quickly and silently, trying to get through it before the crowd's mood could shift. A few cultivated dramatic personas, playing up the theatricality to satisfy the public's desire for spectacle. The condemned themselves sometimes tried to bribe executioners for a quicker, cleaner procedure, slip them some coins, promise them extra payment, anything for mercy. Some executioners accepted these bribes and did their best to honor them. Others considered it dishonest and refused. There wasn't exactly a professional ethics board to provide guidance on this. Let's drift over to the religious aspect again, because it permeated everything and made the psychological burden even heavier. Remember, this is a deeply Christian society. Salvation wasn't abstract, it was real, urgent, the most important thing in existence. And executioners were convinced, or at least constantly told, that their souls were in danger. Some executioners became obsessively pious. They'd attend church whenever allowed, which wasn't always. They'd fund religious services, pay for masses, donate to the poor, commission religious artwork, all attempts to balance out the spiritual weight of their profession.
There's a record from 16th century France of an executioner who paid for a stained glass window in his local church, depicting scenes of divine mercy and forgiveness. He couldn't attend services inside the church, but he could see the window from outside, and presumably he hoped that God would see his contribution and remember it when the time came to judge his soul. Other executioners carried religious tokens constantly: crosses, prayer beads, fragments of saints' relics if they could afford them. They'd pray before work, pray after. Some had rituals where they'd ask forgiveness from the condemned before carrying out the sentence, which must have been awkward for everyone involved. But here's where the church's position gets even more complicated. Some priests and theologians argued that executioners were performing a necessary social function and therefore shouldn't be considered sinful. They were agents of earthly justice, ordained by legitimate authority. Thomas Aquinas had even written about this, arguing that the state had the right to punish wrongdoers and that those who carried out such punishments were not personally culpable. But that theological position didn't always translate to practical acceptance. Individual priests might understand the argument intellectually, but still feel uncomfortable giving communion to someone who regularly ended lives. Congregations might understand it in theory, but still not want to sit next to an executioner in church. Theology said one thing, visceral reaction said another. So you'd have situations where an executioner would be told, yes, technically your soul is fine, but also please leave. The cognitive dissonance must have been maddening. Am I saved or damned? The official doctrine says saved, but the actual priests treat me like I'm damned. So which is it? Some executioners eventually gave up on organized religion entirely, figured if the church wouldn't fully accept them, why bother? Others created their own private religious practices, separate from the official church, trying to maintain their faith without the institutional rejection.
Let's talk about the actual tools and methods in more detail, because understanding the technical side helps explain another layer of stress these men lived under. Different methods required different skills, and an executioner had to be proficient in multiple techniques. Beheading with an axe or sword required precision and strength. You had to strike at exactly the right angle with exactly the right force to ensure a quick,
clean result. Too shallow, and you'd cause suffering while failing to complete the task. Too forceful at the wrong angle, and the blade might glance off bone. Executioners practiced on wooden posts, on animal carcasses, anything to develop the muscle memory and judgment needed. Swords were generally preferred over axes when possible, because a good sword in skilled hands could make the procedure quicker. But swords were expensive. A quality blade designed for this specific purpose cost a fortune. Some executioners inherited blades from their predecessors. Others saved for years to commission one from a master smith. And they maintained these blades obsessively. After each use, extensive cleaning, sharpening, oiling to prevent rust, checking for even tiny fractures in the metal that might cause it to break at the worst possible moment. The blade was the most important professional tool an executioner owned, and its condition directly affected his ability to do his job competently. Hanging required different skills. You had to calculate rope length based on the person's weight and height. Too long, and, well, the result was messier. Too short, and the process took much longer, causing extended suffering. There were formulas, rules of thumb, but bodies varied. Experience helped, but even experienced executioners sometimes got it wrong. The knots mattered too. A poorly tied knot could slip or tighten incorrectly. Ropes had to be inspected for fraying or weakness. The gallows mechanism, if there was one, had to be tested beforehand. All of this was the executioner's responsibility, and all of it could go catastrophically wrong if not done properly. Other methods, we won't detail specifically, but each had its own technical requirements, and an executioner had to know all of them, had to be able to perform whichever method the sentence specified. It was like being required to master multiple complex, precise skills, each with life or death consequences for getting it wrong, and no formal training institution to teach you. Just on-the-job learning and hope you don't make too many mistakes. The aftermath of each procedure was its own ordeal. Someone had to clean the scaffold, remove the remains, dispose of them according to whatever local law specified. Executioners usually handled all of this alone. They'd work late into the evening after a busy day, washing blood off wood, maintaining the site, making sure everything was ready for next time. And next time was always uncertain. In some towns, there might be several procedures in a single week. In others, months might pass with nothing. Executioners lived in this strange state of irregular employment, never quite knowing when they'd be called to work, but knowing they always had to be ready. Couldn't be visibly impaired, couldn't be traveling, couldn't be unavailable. The job owned you even when you weren't actively doing it. Let's float back to family dynamics for a minute, because there are some specific examples that really drive home how this profession consumed entire family structures. In some executioner families, there were complex negotiations about which son would inherit the position. If you had multiple sons, someone had to take it, but which one? The eldest son traditionally inherited, but not all eldest sons wanted it. Some executioner fathers would try to get their eldest into a different profession if possible, even a different dishonorable profession, and pass the executioner role to a younger son. Better to have one child trapped than burden the firstborn with it. But this caused family tensions. Younger sons who got stuck with the job while watching their older brother escape, even marginally, into a slightly less stigmatized position. Resentment built. Families fractured. There are records of executioner brothers not speaking to each other for years over these inheritance decisions.
Daughters of executioners faced their own unique challenges. They were marriageable only to men from other dishonorable families. Their dowries had to be larger to overcome the stigma. Their options were so limited that some executioner families arranged marriages between their daughters and executioners' sons from distant regions, creating these networks of executioner intermarriage spanning multiple territories. Some executioner daughters never married at all, just stayed home, helped with the household, assisted with medical work if their father practiced healing, and lived in quiet isolation. Their lives constrained by something their grandfather or great-grandfather had done decades before they were born. There's a particular sadness in reading records of executioners trying desperately to provide better futures for their daughters, saving money for huge dowries, trying to negotiate marriages with barber surgeons or other low but honorable profession men, writing petitions to authorities requesting that their daughters be legally separated from the family dishonor. Most of these efforts failed, but the attempts themselves show the quiet desperation. One documented case from 17th century Germany involved an executioner who saved his entire life and amassed a considerable sum, then offered it all as dowry for his daughter to marry a struggling merchant. The merchant initially agreed, needed the money desperately, but when word got out about the bride's background, his guild threatened to expel him if he went through with it. The marriage was called off. The executioner's life savings just sat there, useless. His daughter never married. These are the stories that don't make it into dramatic retellings, the quiet tragedies, the accumulated weight of social restrictions destroying people slowly over years and decades rather than in any single dramatic moment. Let's talk about attempted escapes from the profession, because those are telling too. We mentioned people trying to move to new towns, start over, but there were other strategies people attempted, with varying degrees of success.
Some executioners tried to save enough money to essentially buy their way out. They'd petition the local authority, offer a large sum to be released from the position, and hope the town would accept and find someone else. Sometimes this worked, especially if the executioner could suggest a replacement, like a younger brother or nephew. The position stayed in the family, but at least one person got out. More often, it didn't work. Towns that had a competent executioner didn't want to lose him and have to train or recruit someone new. So they'd refuse the petition, maybe even increase the executioner's salary slightly as incentive to stay. And that was that. You're not going anywhere. Other executioners tried legal arguments, claiming they'd been forced into the position unjustly, arguing that their ancestor had been dishonored wrongly, so the family's dishonorable status should be revoked. These petitions would wind through bureaucratic processes for years sometimes. Occasionally, very occasionally, they succeeded. Franz Schmidt's eventual success in restoring his family honor took decades of petitions, demonstrations of good character, testimonials from satisfied medical patients, and probably a fair amount of luck. When he finally got that letter declaring his family honorable again, he was an old man. He'd spent his entire adult life working toward that single goal. And he got it, which makes him one of the lucky ones. Most petitions went nowhere. You'd spend years gathering documentation, writing appeals, getting testimonials, paying for legal assistance. You'd submit everything to the relevant authorities, and months later you'd get back a brief letter, petition denied. No detailed explanation, no recourse, just no. Back to work. The emotional toll of these failed attempts must have been crushing. That moment of hope when you submitted the petition, the weeks or months of waiting, the fantasy of what life might be like if it succeeded, and then the denial, the collapse of that hope, the realization that you'd be doing this job until you physically couldn't anymore, and then your son would take over, and his son after him. Forever.
Some executioners just broke under the accumulated weight of it all. There are records of executioners abandoning their positions and disappearing, just walking away. They'd end up as vagrants, beggars, criminals, because what employment could they find? Their face was known, their background traceable. They'd traded the misery of being an executioner for the misery of having nothing at all. Others stayed, but deteriorated, developed drinking problems that affected their work, became unreliable, got into altercations. Eventually, they'd be replaced, either by a family member or by the town recruiting someone new, and the cycle would begin again. The few executioners who managed to retire in some kind of peace seemed to have shared certain characteristics. They were exceptionally competent at the work, which bought them respect even within a stigmatized profession. They developed successful side businesses, usually medical practice, that gave them alternate income and some degree of social value. They maintained meticulous records and reputations for honesty, which helped in later petitions. And they had luck, timing, the right political climate, sympathetic authorities, all things outside their control. Let's drift into some regional specifics, because the variations across Europe show how these same basic patterns played out differently depending on local customs and laws. In Spain, executioners were sometimes called verdugos and faced similar stigmatization as their counterparts elsewhere, but with some interesting differences. Spanish executioners also sometimes doubled as torturers during legal interrogations. This was technically a separate role, but often fell to the same person, which only added to the social taint, because now you weren't just carrying out final sentences, you were also involved in the preliminary judicial process. Another layer of dishonor, another reason for people to avoid you. In Italian city-states, the situation varied wildly by location. Venice had executioners who worked for the Council of Ten and were shrouded in secrecy. They wore masks. Their identities were supposedly protected. In practice, everyone probably knew who they were anyway, because Venice wasn't that big, but the theatrical secrecy was maintained. Florence, Milan, Naples all had their own systems. Some cities hired executioners on contract rather than employing them permanently. You'd be brought in for a specific task, paid, and then leave. This avoided some of the long-term social contamination, but meant constant travel and uncertainty. Never really having a home, always being a stranger. That came with its own problems. In Eastern Europe, particularly Poland and parts of Hungary, executioners existed within similar frameworks of dishonor, but with some variations in how the role intersected with local legal customs. The specifics are less well documented than Western European cases, but the basic pattern holds: necessary but reviled, employed but stigmatized, trapped. Scandinavian countries had executioners who sometimes enjoyed slightly better social standing, possibly because the communities were smaller and more isolated. When everyone knows everyone, complete social exclusion becomes harder to maintain practically. You can't totally avoid someone in a town of 300 people, so there was more day-to-day interaction, even if the stigma remained. But slightly better is relative. They were still doing a job nobody wanted, still marked by it,
still passing it to their children because options were limited, just maybe with a tiny bit less absolute isolation than their German or French counterparts. The Holy Roman Empire, being a patchwork of different territories with different local laws, had huge variations. An executioner in one principality might have specific rights and privileges that one in the neighboring territory didn't. They might be allowed to live in town in one place, but forced outside the walls 20 miles away. The legal and social landscape was a maze.
This actually sometimes worked to executioners' advantage. If conditions were particularly bad in one territory, you might be able to negotiate a transfer to another. The network of executioner families helped here. If you had a cousin in another principality willing to swap positions or retire and recommend you, you could potentially move. It didn't solve the fundamental problem of being an executioner, but it might at least get you into a slightly less hostile environment. Let's talk about the end of the profession as a distinct, hereditary, stigmatized role, because it didn't end suddenly, but rather gradually faded over centuries. The Enlightenment started shifting attitudes about crime and punishment. Executions became less public, less frequent. The theatrical, ritualistic aspects diminished. Professionalization of state functions meant executioners gradually became more like any other state employee, just another bureaucratic role. The spiritual and social taint slowly, very slowly, began to dissipate. By the 1800s, in many places, executioners could live more normal lives. Their children could enter other professions. The hereditary trap was breaking. But this process took generations. The same executioner families that had been trapped for centuries continued for decades after the stigma began to lift, because they had the expertise and nobody else wanted to develop it. The Sansons continued in France until the mid-1800s. The Reichardts in Bavaria continued into the 20th century. The last Reichardt, Johann, was still working during World War II. These later executioners lived in a weird transitional period. The absolute social stigma was gone or greatly reduced. They could live in cities, attend church, have normal social interactions. But they were still doing work that nobody else wanted, still carrying that psychological burden, still occasionally facing prejudice or discomfort from people who knew what they did. And then, gradually, the job itself largely disappeared as most countries moved away from capital punishment, or when they retained it, professionalized and bureaucratized it to the point where it bore no resemblance to the medieval profession. No more hereditary executioners, no more families trapped for generations, no more social stigma attached to a necessary but reviled function. But for those centuries, from roughly the 1200s through the 1800s, it was a constant. In every major town there was an executioner, and that person was living a life constrained by forces beyond their control, performing a function society demanded while bearing society's contempt, trying to maintain some shred of dignity and hope within a system designed to deny them both. We are deep in this now, the slow, grinding tragedy of it, the accumulated weight of generations, the individual stories of people trying to live within absurd constraints. Let's keep drifting through this particular historical nightmare, because there's still more to unpack.
So, let's drift into some of the weirder social customs and superstitions that surrounded executioners, because medieval society had this whole elaborate mythology built up around these people. And I mean,
When you've already decided someone is spiritually tainted and socially untouchable, why not throw in some magical thinking while you're at it? There was this widespread belief that executioners could sense guilt, that they had some kind of supernatural ability to know if someone was truly guilty of their crimes. Completely unfounded, obviously. An executioner had no special insight. He just showed up and did what the court ordered. But the myth persisted. In some regions, there were rituals where the executioner would look into the eyes of the condemned before the procedure, supposedly to discern their guilt or innocence, as if decades of doing this job had granted him some mystical judgment powers. In reality, the executioner was probably just going through a practiced routine, maybe offering some brief moment of human acknowledgement before doing something horrible, but people interpreted it as mystical. Some folks believed that if an executioner hesitated or showed reluctance, it meant the condemned was innocent, that the executioner's supernatural sense was warning him. Again, complete nonsense. An executioner might hesitate because he was tired, or because he knew the person, or because he was having a bad day, or because the crowd was hostile. Nothing mystical about it. But these beliefs gave people a framework for understanding something that was otherwise just bureaucratic and terrible. The hand of glory we mentioned earlier is worth exploring more, because it's one of those delightfully grim medieval superstitions. The belief was that the hand of someone who'd been executed, if properly preserved and prepared, could be used as a kind of magical tool. Light a candle made from that person's fat, mounted on their preserved hand, and supposedly it would freeze anyone who saw it in place. Perfect for burglars, supposedly.
Executioners were often the only people with legal access to the bodies to create these things. So there was actually a black market for this stuff, and executioners could supplement their income by selling, let's call them specialty items, to people who believed in this sort of magic. Whether the executioners themselves believed in it is unclear, but money is money, and if someone wants to pay you for something you have access to, well, that's just good business sense in a profession that didn't offer many income opportunities. Similarly, blood from the executed was thought to cure various ailments. Epilepsy specifically was believed to be treatable with fresh blood. So you'd have people showing up at executions with cups or rags, trying to collect some. Executioners sometimes charged for access, let people get closer to the scaffold, sold blood-soaked cloths afterward. Again, probably didn't believe it worked, but if desperate people wanted to pay for it, why refuse? Pieces of the rope used in hangings were good luck charms. Keep one in your pocket for protection. Hang one in your home to ward off harm. Executioners would cut up the ropes after use and sell the pieces. Some entrepreneurial executioners kept old ropes specifically for this purpose and would sell authentic execution rope that had never actually been used for anything. Medieval capitalism at work. The clothing of the condemned traditionally belonged to the executioner. He could claim it as a perk of the job, which meant that after a procedure, the executioner would strip the body and take everything: shirts, pants, shoes, whatever. Then he'd sell it all. Some people bought these items believing they had magical properties. Others just wanted cheap used clothing and didn't care about the morbid provenance. This created some awkward situations. Imagine being so poor you're buying a dead person's clothes from the executioner, but also being unwilling to actually touch the executioner during the transaction. So there'd be these elaborate handoffs where money and goods were exchanged without physical contact, placed on a table, picked up separately, everyone maintaining the pretense that no direct interaction had occurred. Some executioners set up little shops, basically where they sold all this stuff: charms, remedies, used clothing, rendered fat for various purposes. They couldn't set up inside town, of course, so these shops would be on the outskirts, near the execution grounds usually. People would come by, browse the inventory, make purchases while maintaining maximum physical distance. Very efficient, very weird. Let's talk about the relationship between executioners and the medical profession, because that's another layer of strangeness. We've mentioned that executioners often practiced medicine, particularly bone setting and tooth pulling. But the relationship went deeper than just executioners doing side work. Medical schools, particularly in Italy and France, started emerging in the late medieval period, and they needed bodies for anatomical study. Where do you get bodies for dissection? Well, the bodies of executed criminals were sometimes made available for this purpose. And who had access to those bodies? The executioner. So, you'd have these situations where executioners worked with university physicians, delivering bodies, sometimes even assisting with dissections because the executioner had practical knowledge of anatomy from his regular work. This created professional relationships between executioners and educated medical men, which was bizarre given the social stigma. A physician might refuse to eat at the same table as an executioner, but would work alongside him in an anatomy theater, both of them elbow deep in a cadaver, discussing the structure of human organs. The cognitive dissonance must have been remarkable. I respect your anatomical expertise and value our professional collaboration, but also please don't come to my house or speak to my family. Some executioners actually became quite knowledgeable about medicine through this exposure. They'd observe surgical techniques, learn about different approaches to treating injuries, build relationships with physicians, who, if they didn't quite treat the executioner as a social equal, at least treated him as a professional colleague in specific contexts. Franz Schmidt, our journal-keeping friend, was particularly successful at this. He built a reputation as a skilled healer, treated hundreds of patients over his career, kept detailed notes on what treatments worked for which conditions. By the end of his career, he was more known for his medical work than his executioner work, which is probably exactly what he wanted. But this success was unusual. Most executioners who practiced medicine operated in a much more marginal space. They treated people who couldn't afford real physicians. They worked with folk remedies and practical experience rather than formal medical theory. They were, essentially, unlicensed medical practitioners serving the poorest segments of society. And the treatments were variable in quality. Some executioners were genuinely skilled and helpful. Others were probably doing more harm than good, but nobody could prove it because medical knowledge was limited anyway. If someone died after treatment, was it because the executioner was incompetent or because the condition was fatal regardless? Hard to say. No malpractice lawsuits in medieval Europe. Let's drift over to the subject of executioner housing, because the physical spaces these people inhabited reflected their social position in interesting ways. We mentioned they often lived outside town walls, but what did those homes actually look like? In many cases, executioners lived in buildings provided by the town or local lord as part of their employment. These weren't usually nice buildings. They were functional, small, often poorly maintained, because who's going to prioritize the executioner's comfort? The structure would be near the execution grounds for convenience, which meant it was also near where bodies were disposed of, where the gallows stood, all the trappings of the profession. Imagine waking up every morning and looking out your window at a gallows, at a burial pit, at the tools of your trade, just sitting there waiting for the next use. That was the daily reality. Your workspace and your living space merged into this constant reminder of what you did for a living. Some executioners tried to make their homes as normal as possible inside. Furnishings, decorations, attempts at domesticity. Others seemingly gave up and just lived in Spartan functionality. Why bother decorating when nobody's ever going to visit anyway? Because that was another thing. Executioners couldn't have normal social gatherings. No dinner parties, no neighbors dropping by to borrow tools, no spontaneous social interactions. Your home was your isolation chamber. Your family were the only people who'd ever enter it willingly. The exceptions were other executioner families. Because they could interact with each other without additional contamination, executioner families would sometimes visit each other. If there was another executioner family within traveling distance, you might actually have something resembling a social life. Occasional visits, marriages arranged between families, children playing together, small windows of normalcy. But if you were the only executioner family in the region, which was common in less populated areas, you were just alone. You, your spouse, your children. That's it. That's your entire social world, for generations. The psychological impact of this isolation on children is something we can only imagine. Growing up in a household where nobody from outside ever visits, where your parents are avoided in public, where you can't play with other children, where your future is already determined and there's nothing you can do about it. Some executioner children seem to have internalized the stigma and became withdrawn and isolated themselves. Others became resentful and angry, acting out against a society that had marked them from birth. A few, the lucky or resilient ones, managed to maintain some sense of self-worth and hope despite everything. But it couldn't have been easy for any of them. Let's talk about the religious orders and executioners, because there were some interesting intersections. Certain monastic orders took it upon themselves to provide spiritual comfort to the condemned. They'd visit prisons, pray with people scheduled for execution, accompany them to the scaffold, offer last rites. These monks or priests would necessarily interact with executioners as part of this work, and it created complicated dynamics. The priest is there to save a soul. The executioner is there to end a life. They're working at cross purposes, kind of, but also both fulfilling roles within the same legal and spiritual system. Some executioners developed relationships with these religious figures, would talk with them about the spiritual weight of the work, seek reassurance about their own souls, ask whether they were damned for doing what the state required. The answers they got varied depending on the individual priest's theology and personality. Some priests were kind, reassuring. You are performing a legal function. You're not personally responsible for the moral weight. Your soul is safe if you remain faithful. Others were more ambivalent or even harsh. Every life you take is a mark against you. Pray for forgiveness constantly and hope for mercy. Neither answer was probably very comforting, honestly. There are records of executioners making deathbed confessions that lasted hours, just pouring out decades of accumulated guilt and spiritual anxiety to a priest, naming every person they'd executed, describing every procedure, begging for assurance of salvation. The priests listening to all of this, trying to provide comfort, probably wondering how to possibly absolve someone of something that was technically legal but felt spiritually monstrous. The concept of purgatory was probably comforting to executioners, actually. This idea that even if your soul wasn't quite clean enough for immediate heaven, you could still be purified eventually. It left the door open. You weren't necessarily damned, just delayed. Executioners funded masses for their own souls after their eventual passing, tried to set up enough prayers and spiritual assistance to get through purgatory in a reasonable time frame.
Whether any of this brought genuine comfort is hard to say, but it was something, some framework for dealing with the spiritual implications of the work. Better than just living in constant terror of damnation with no hope at all. Let's drift into the subject of executioner marks and clothing requirements, because these varied by region and tell us a lot about how societies managed the problem of having executioners among them. In some German territories, executioners had to wear specific colors. Red and yellow were common. Bright, visible, distinct. You'd see an executioner coming from a good distance away, could avoid him if you wanted. The clothing marked him as clearly as a leper's bell. Other places required executioners to wear specific symbols or badges, a sword and axe emblem, a distinctive hat, something that announced the profession visually. These weren't exactly optional fashion choices, they were legal requirements. Fail to wear the identifying marks and you could be fined or punished. The stated reason was public safety. People needed to know they were near an executioner so they could avoid contact if they chose. But the practical effect was constant, inescapable marking. You couldn't just blend in, couldn't have a moment of anonymity. Everywhere you went, you were identified first and foremost as the executioner. Some executioners seemed to embrace this, wore the clothing with a certain dark pride, leaned into the identity since they couldn't escape it anyway. Others clearly hated it. There are records of executioners petitioning to be allowed to wear normal clothing, at least when not actively working. Some of these petitions were granted, most weren't.
In France, the marking requirements were sometimes less strict, but social recognition served the same function. In a small to medium-sized town, everyone knew who the executioner was. Didn't need special clothing to identify him. His face, his family, his address, all common knowledge. No escape through anonymity. Larger cities, like Paris, offered slightly more space to disappear. You could potentially walk through parts of the city where people didn't know you personally, have brief interactions with strangers who didn't immediately recognize your profession. Small mercies, but meaningful when your entire existence otherwise was defined by social exclusion. Let's talk about executioner guilds, or rather the lack thereof, because that's telling. Most professions in medieval towns organized into guilds. These were powerful organizations that controlled training, maintained standards, protected members' interests, and provided social structure. Executioners couldn't join guilds. They were explicitly excluded from essentially all guild structures because guilds were organizations of honorable craftsmen and executioners were dishonorable by definition. So there was no guild support, no collective bargaining, no professional organization looking out for your interests. Some executioner families tried to create informal networks that functioned kind of like guilds. They'd communicate across regions, share information about job openings, arrange marriages between families, provide mutual support. But these were informal and had no legal standing. Just executioner families trying to help each other survive in a hostile social environment. The lack of guild membership also meant executioners had no formal path for resolving disputes. If a town council decided to cut your pay, what could you do?
You couldn't appeal to a guild, couldn't organize with other executioners for collective action because there weren't other executioners nearby. You could petition the authorities directly, but you had no leverage. Accept the pay cut or lose the position entirely.
Similarly, if someone assaulted you or refused to pay you for services rendered, your legal recourse was limited. Your testimony in court was considered less reliable because of your dishonorable status. You might win your case, but you might not, and the whole process reminded you of your diminished legal standing. Some towns took advantage of this, would hire an executioner, work him hard, then refuse to pay the agreed amount. What's he going to do? Sue? Good luck with that. Accept the reduced payment and continue working, or leave and have nothing. Most executioners accepted the reduced payment. Let's drift over to the rare cases of executioners who became famous or notorious for reasons beyond just their profession, because those are interesting outliers. There's a guy named Bull who worked in London in the early 1500s. He apparently had a distinctive method and became known for it. People would specifically mention if someone was ended by Bull, as if his technique was recognizable. He also apparently had a side business selling remedies and charms and was quite successful at it. Managed to accumulate some wealth. Still socially marginalized, still an executioner, but at least financially comfortable. In France during the Revolution, there was an assistant executioner named Henri Sansons, son of Charles Henri, who apparently fainted during one particularly high-profile procedure, just completely passed out from the stress, had to be revived while his father finished the work. This became famous, gossiped about in Paris. Henri eventually took over the family position despite this embarrassing moment, because what else was he going to do? The family business had to continue. There were executioners who became known for being particularly efficient or particularly brutal, and these reputations would spread. An executioner in one town might be known throughout the region as the Quick One, or the Butcher, or whatever nickname captured their approach to the work. These reputations affected their employment prospects. Towns might specifically request an executioner known for efficiency, or avoid one known for being sloppy. Some executioners tried to cultivate positive reputations deliberately, would emphasize their professionalism, their precision, their experience. Anything to make themselves seem like skilled professionals rather than just social outcasts doing dirty work. It rarely elevated their social standing much, but it might help with employment stability. Others didn't bother, figured their reputation was ruined anyway by the mere fact of the profession, so why try? These executioners often drank more, cared less about the quality of their work, became bitter and nihilistic. Can't really blame them, honestly. If society has already decided you're worthless, maintaining professional pride takes enormous psychological strength. Let's talk about the transition periods when an executioner died or retired and a replacement was needed, because those reveal a lot about how the system functioned. If the executioner had a son who was old enough and willing to take over, the transition was straightforward. Some training period where the son assisted the father. Then the father would officially step down or pass away, and the son would petition to be recognized as the new executioner. Usually approved without much fuss. But if there was no son, or the son was too young, or somehow the family line had ended, towns had a problem. They needed an executioner. Who were they going to get? Sometimes they'd recruit from other dishonorable professions. ask the knacker or skinner if they wanted to take on executioner duties as well. Sometimes those men accepted because the pay was better. Sometimes they refused because even among dishonorable professions, executioner was particularly stigmatized. Other times, towns would reach out to executioner families in other regions, offer the position to a younger son from an executioner dynasty who hadn't inherited his father's position. These men might relocate, bringing their family to a new town to take up the work. New place, same social isolation. In desperate cases, towns would offer the position to criminals, that deal we mentioned earlier. Take this job or face your sentence. And some men accepted, trading one kind of death for a different, slower kind of social death. There are records of towns going months without an executioner, just not being able to find anyone willing to take the position. Sentences would pile up, prisoners would sit in dungeons waiting. The court would keep sending requests to neighboring regions, trying to borrow an executioner temporarily. Eventually, someone would accept, and the backlog would be cleared in a grim few days of constant work. The difficulty in finding executioners actually gave the existing ones a tiny bit of leverage occasionally. If you knew your town couldn't easily replace you, you might be able to negotiate slightly better terms. Not much better. You were still dishonorable, still stigmatized, but maybe a small raise, maybe a better housing situation. Small victories. We're deep into the strange, sad mechanics of this profession now. The accumulated details of how a society maintained a system that required people to perform functions the society then punished them for performing. The cognitive dissonance at a structural level playing out across centuries, destroying lives, generation after generation. Let's keep drifting through this particular corner of historical misery.
So let's drift into some of the psychological coping mechanisms executioners developed. Because you don't do this job for decades without finding some way to deal with it mentally. And the strategies people used ranged from the deeply religious to the deeply alcoholic, with a whole spectrum of approaches in between. We've touched on the religious obsession some executioners developed: constant prayer, funding of masses, religious donations. But let's get more specific about what that looked like day to day. Some executioners developed elaborate pre-work rituals. They'd pray for hours before a scheduled procedure, ask for divine guidance and forgiveness, recite specific psalms, light candles, create this whole spiritual framework around the work to make it feel less like sin and more like reluctant obedience to earthly authority. After the work was done, more prayers, prayers for the soul of the deceased, prayers for their own soul, prayers for forgiveness. Some executioners kept prayer journals where they'd record every person they'd executed and pray for each one by name for the rest of their lives. Just this running list of names, growing longer year by year, each representing a life ended and a prayer obligation created. Whether this brought genuine peace or just added to the psychological burden is hard to say. On one hand, it gave structure and meaning. On the other, you're literally maintaining a list of everyone whose life you ended. That can't have been easy to look at. Other executioners went a completely different direction and embraced emotional detachment, treated the work as purely mechanical, a job, a series of technical tasks to be performed efficiently. Don't think about the person, just think about the procedure. Is the blade sharp? Is the rope the correct length? Is the scaffold stable? Focus on the practical details and ignore the existential horror of what you're actually doing.
This approach probably worked better for maintaining day-to-day functionality. You can't spend 8 hours crying about the human tragedy of it all and still get your work done. Emotional distance was probably necessary for basic psychological survival, but it came with its own costs. That kind of sustained detachment does things to a person, makes you colder, harder, less able to connect with people even when you're not working. Executioner families sometimes noted that their father or grandfather had become distant and uncommunicative over the years. Started off more emotionally open, gradually withdrew into himself. The job wore him down. By the end, he was just going through the motions, living, but not really alive, present, but emotionally absent. Alcohol was another common coping mechanism, and probably the most straightforward. Can't deal with what you did today? Drink until you can't remember it clearly. Wake up, do it again, repeat until your liver gives out or you die of something else first. Not healthy, but understandable. Tavern records from various towns show executioners running up substantial tabs, drinking alone because nobody would sit with them, but drinking a lot. Some executioners died of what we'd now recognize as alcoholism-related conditions, liver failure, various complications from sustained heavy drinking. The records usually just note they died of illness or natural causes, but reading between the lines, it's pretty clear what happened. Some executioners turned to their medical practice as a psychological counterbalance. Yes, you end lives as your official function, but you also heal people in your unofficial capacity. You set bones, you pull infected teeth, you treat wounds, you bring relief from pain. Maybe that balances out somehow. Maybe doing some good compensates for the harm. This seems to have genuinely helped some executioners maintain their sanity and sense of self-worth. They could point to the people they'd helped, the lives they'd improved, the suffering they'd reduced. It wasn't much, but it was something, a thread of meaning in an otherwise bleak existence. Franz Schmidt clearly found meaning in his healing work. His journal entries about medical cases are more detailed and engaged than his execution entries. You can feel him caring about whether treatments worked, wanting to help people, taking pride in successful interventions. The medical work was where he found dignity when his official profession offered none. Let's talk about some specific regional practices that show the variety of experiences executioners had across Europe. In some parts of Switzerland, executioners were allowed to claim certain tolls and fees that weren't related to their official duties. They could charge bakers for using public ovens, could collect fees from people bringing livestock into town. These were arbitrary assignments, basically just giving the executioner additional income streams, but they created constant friction. Imagine you're a baker. You already pay various taxes and fees to the town, and now you also have to pay the executioner, who you consider spiritually tainted and socially beneath you just for the privilege of using the oven. You'd resent it. Everyone resented it, but it was the law, so people paid up while grumbling. Executioners collecting these fees faced constant hostility. People would forget to pay, would argue about the amounts, would make the whole transaction as unpleasant as possible. Some executioners hired collectors to handle it for them just to avoid the daily confrontations. But hiring collectors meant sharing the income, so most just dealt with the hostility directly.
In parts of what's now the Czech Republic, executioners sometimes served as town criers as well. They'd walk through the streets announcing news, proclamations, upcoming trials. This made a certain practical sense. The executioner was already a town employee, already doing work nobody else wanted. Why not add another unpopular job to his duties?
But it created this surreal situation where the same person announcing marriages and births and market days was also the person who'd carry out punishments. You'd hear his voice calling out some cheerful civic announcement, and you'd be reminded that this same person might someday be the last face you see if you run afoul of the law. Very comforting, great for community morale. In some Italian regions, executioners wore distinctive red clothing, not just as a mark, but elaborate red outfits, red cloaks, red hats. Supposedly, this was symbolic, representing blood and justice and divine judgment. In practice, it just made executioners even more visually distinct and impossible to ignore, walking around dressed like a living warning sign. Some executioners apparently leaned into this theatrical presentation, would wear the red clothing with a certain dramatic flair, play up the ominous appearance. If you're going to be marked and avoided anyway, might as well make it memorable. Others hated the costume requirement and wore the plainest red garments they could get away with, trying to minimize the spectacle. Let's drift into the early modern period, because that's when things slowly started to shift. The Reformation and Counter-Reformation brought new theological debates about sin, responsibility, and the role of the state. Some Protestant theologians argued more strongly that executioners were simply fulfilling a legitimate state function and shouldn't be considered sinful. This didn't immediately change social attitudes. Theology is one thing, visceral cultural stigma is another. But it started creating space for questioning the whole system. If executioners aren't actually sinful, why do we treat them like they are? Why the hereditary dishonor? Why the social exclusion? The answers to these questions were basically because that's how we've always done it, which isn't a great theological or philosophical argument. But traditions die hard, especially when they're embedded in legal codes and social customs across multiple generations.
The Enlightenment accelerated these changes. Thinkers started questioning the entire framework of honor and dishonor, arguing for more rational approaches to law and punishment, suggesting that maybe, just maybe, the person carrying out legal sentences shouldn't be socially destroyed for doing so. Cesare Beccaria's On Crimes and Punishments, published in 1764, questioned the whole structure of criminal justice, including the role and treatment of executioners. Voltaire wrote about the absurdity of stigmatizing people for performing state functions. These ideas circulated among educated elites and slowly, very slowly, began to influence policy. Some territories started removing the legal designation of executioners as dishonorable, officially declaring that the profession didn't carry automatic dishonor. These were symbolic victories, more than practical ones initially. Legal status could change faster than social attitudes. An executioner might be legally honorable, but still socially avoided. But over decades, the stigma weakened. By the early 1800s in many places, executioners could live in town, attend church, have their children educated in regular schools. They still weren't popular. Nobody was inviting the executioner to dinner parties, but the absolute, crushing social exclusion was lessening. Executioner families that had survived for generations started seeing opportunities for their children.
Sons could apprentice to real trades. Daughters could marry outside the narrow circle of dishonorable professions. The hereditary trap was breaking, finally. Franz Schmidt's success in the early 1600s was exceptional and rare. By the early 1800s, it was becoming more common. Not easy, but possible. Executioners who wanted out for themselves or their children had paths that hadn't existed before.
The professionalization of state functions also changed the role. As governments became more bureaucratic and centralized, executioners increasingly became just another category of state employee. They had set salaries, official job descriptions, defined responsibilities. They weren't hereditary outcasts anymore. They were civil servants who happened to have an unpleasant specialty. This change happened at different rates in different places. France professionalized earlier. Parts of Germany held on to the old system longer. England had always been somewhat in between and stayed that way. But the overall trend across the 1700s and 1800s was toward normalization. The Sansons family in France experienced this transition firsthand. Early Sansons lived under intense stigma. Middle-generation Sansons saw gradual improvement. Later Sansons were essentially just doing a job, unpleasant but not socially destroying. Charles-Henri Sanson, working during the Revolution, was still stigmatized to a degree, but he could also publish his memoirs, could participate in public discourse, could be treated as a person with opinions and experiences worth recording. His great-grandfather wouldn't have had that option. By the time the last Sanson left the profession in the mid-1800s, the role had changed fundamentally. Still not a desirable job, still carrying some social weight, but nothing like the medieval experience of total exclusion and hereditary contamination. The Reichardt family in Bavaria continued even longer into the 20th century. Johann Reichardt, the last of the line, worked during the Nazi period and afterward briefly for the Allied occupation. He was a state employee, had a house, a family, a relatively normal life aside from his work. The work itself was horrific, especially during the Nazi years when he was incredibly busy, but his social experience bore almost no resemblance to a medieval executioner's life. He could go to restaurants, could attend church, could have normal conversations with neighbors. His children weren't marked for life. After he retired, he just lived. Died in 1972, having spent his retirement as a normal elderly man. The profession had been with his family for generations, but by the end, it was just a job he'd done, not an identity that consumed everything. Let's talk about how modern historians and scholars have tried to understand the medieval executioner's experience, because it's actually quite difficult to fully grasp from our perspective. We live in a world where professions don't carry inherent spiritual contamination, where your father's job doesn't determine your entire life trajectory, where social exclusion isn't legally codified. The idea that someone could be required by law to perform a state function and then punished socially for performing that function seems absurd to us. The contradiction is obvious, but for medieval people, it apparently wasn't contradictory at all. Or if it was, the contradiction was just accepted as part of how the world worked. Understanding the executioner's psychological experience is even harder. We have the external facts, the laws, the social customs, the documented cases, but getting at the internal experience, what it actually felt like to live this life, requires reading between the lines of sparse historical records. Franz Schmidt's journal is valuable precisely because it gives us a window, however narrow, into one executioner's inner world. The emotional exhaustion, the desperate desire for honor and recognition, the pride in medical work, the relief at finally escaping. We can glimpse his humanity through the dry record-keeping. But most executioners didn't leave journals. Their experiences are lost, except for occasional mentions in town records or court documents. We know they existed. We know broadly how they were treated, but the individual human stories, the specific hopes and fears and struggles, those are mostly gone. What we're left with is a structural understanding. We can describe the system, explain how it functioned, document the laws and customs, but the actual lived experience of being a person trapped in that system, generation after generation, that's harder to fully capture. Modern historians have tried. There are academic studies of executioner families, analyses of the legal frameworks, explorations of the theological justifications and contradictions. But even the best scholarship can only approximate what it must have been like to wake up every day knowing you're considered fundamentally contaminated by society, knowing your children will inherit that status, knowing there's no real escape. Some historical reenactment groups have tried to recreate the material conditions of executioner life, the housing, the tools, the daily routines. But you can't really reenact social stigma. You can't simulate what it feels like to have every person in town avoid you. Can't recreate the accumulated psychological weight of years of isolation. The material history is accessible. The emotional history is largely lost. Let's drift toward some final thoughts here, because we've covered a lot of ground and we're winding down this particular historical nightmare. The story of medieval executioners is ultimately a story about how societies create necessary functions and then destroy the people who perform them, about the human cost of maintaining social order through force and fear. Every town needed an executioner. The legal system demanded it. Justice, as they understood it, required someone to carry out punishments. But rather than honor that necessity, rather than respect the people doing this necessary work, medieval society chose to stigmatize them completely, to make them untouchable, to mark them and their children for generations. And the justification was what, exactly? Spiritual contamination? But they're performing a legal function ordered by legitimate authority. Social necessity? But we're the ones creating that necessity by demanding these punishments. Tradition? Just because something has always been done a certain way doesn't make it logical or just. The whole system was built on contradictions that nobody seemed interested in resolving. We need executioners, but we despise them. We pay them, but we exclude them. We order them to work, but we consider them tainted for working. And rather than fix these contradictions, medieval society just forced generation after generation of executioner families to live within them. The slow dissolution of this system over the early modern period shows that it was never actually necessary. The stigma wasn't inevitable. Societies could function with executioners who were treated as normal people doing an unpleasant job. The medieval approach was a choice, not a requirement. But for the centuries when it was the dominant approach, it destroyed countless lives. How many people lived in quiet desperation, performing necessary work while being socially erased?
How many children grew up isolated and hopeless? How many families struggled for generations against a stigma they never deserved? We'll never know the exact numbers, never know most of their names, never hear their stories and their own words. They lived on the margins of history, performing central functions while being pushed to the edges of society. And then they died, usually poor, usually still marked by dishonor, and were mostly forgotten. The few executioners we remember, like Franz Schmidt or the Sansons, we remember because they left records or became famous. But they represent hundreds or thousands of others whose names are lost, who did the same work, carried the same burden, and vanished from history without a trace. There's something quietly tragic about that. Not dramatic tragedy, not the kind of history that makes for exciting documentaries or popular books. Just the slow, grinding tragedy of people trapped in systems that destroyed them for performing functions those very systems required.
Medieval executioners weren't heroes. They weren't villains. They were just people trying to survive in circumstances they didn't choose, doing work they mostly didn't want to do, carrying burdens that shouldn't have been placed on them in the first place. And when we look back at their lives from our comfortable modern perspective, what we're really seeing is a reminder of how societies can create cruelty through systems and structures rather than individual malice. Nobody was specifically trying to destroy executioner families. The system just did it automatically, generation after generation, because that's how the system was designed. It took centuries to dismantle that system, centuries for the stigma to fade, for the hereditary trap to break, for executioners to become simply people doing an unpleasant job rather than contaminated outcasts marked for life. The change came eventually, but for the people living through the worst centuries of the system, eventually wasn't soon enough. So as we drift to the end of this long exploration of medieval executioners and their miserable profession, what are we left with? A better understanding of how professional and social stigma worked in medieval society, some appreciation for the specific human experiences of people trapped in impossible situations, and maybe a quiet gratitude that we don't live in a world where your great-grandfather's occupation determines your entire life trajectory. The executioner's story is a corner of history that's easy to overlook. It's not glamorous, not exciting, just sad and grinding and thoroughly depressing. But it's worth knowing about precisely because it shows us something important about how societies function, how systems perpetuate themselves, and how individual human lives can be crushed by structural forces.
These were real people. They had hopes, they had fears. They tried to live with dignity in situations designed to deny them dignity. Most of them failed through no fault of their own. A few succeeded against overwhelming odds. All of them deserve to be remembered as more than just the grim function they performed. So there we are, the story of why nobody wanted to be a medieval executioner, told in exhaustive, hopefully sleep-inducing detail. If you're still awake, well, maybe you learned something. If you've drifted off, that's fine too. That's kind of the point. Medieval executioners lived lives of quiet desperation, generation after generation, trapped by forces beyond their control. We've spent the last few hours exploring those lives in detail, and now we can let them rest, finally,
their story told, even if their names are mostly forgotten. Sleep well, and be grateful you live in an era where your profession doesn't spiritually contaminate you and doom your children to hereditary dishonor. Because that was absolutely a thing that happened to real people for real centuries, and it was exactly as terrible as it sounds. Good night.